Jackson Reed had his hand on the door when he said it. I should leave before I do something foolish. He meant it. Bag packed. Horse saddled. $14 in his pocket, and a heart he didn't trust anymore. Clara Whitmore didn't flinch. Didn't beg. Didn't reach for him. She just looked at him the way a woman looks at a man she's already figured out, steady, a little amused, and entirely dangerous. Do it first, she said quietly. Then decide. He stood there, bag in hand, door open, road waiting, and he couldn't move a single inch. If you're new here, subscribe, follow this story to the very end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Wyoming Territory. August 1987. The summer that nearly killed Clara Whitmore began the same way most disasters did, quietly without warning, wearing the face of ordinary trouble. She was 29 years old, unmarried, and standing in the middle of a yard that used to mean something, holding a letter from the First Territorial Bank of Casper that she had already read 4 times. She didn't need to read it again. She had the important parts memorized. 30 days. 30 days before the ranch her father had built with his bare hands on land he had broken his back to claim would be signed over to satisfy a debt he never should have taken on in the first place. She folded the letter, tucked it into her apron pocket, looked out at the wide sunburned land stretching in every direction, and said nothing because there was no one left to say anything to. Her father, George Whitmore, had died 6 weeks earlier. Heart gave out in the middle of the east pasture on a Thursday afternoon, which was exactly the kind of thing George Whitmore would have done, work himself to death on a Thursday, as if dying on a weekend would have been an inconvenience. They found him face down in the dirt, one hand still gripping a fence post he'd been trying to reset. The post was still crooked. Clara had fixed it herself the morning after they buried him, before the grief had a chance to settle into her bones and make her useless. She reset that post alone in the dark, crying so hard she could barely see the mallet. But she reset it. Because that was what you did when the land was yours, and the work didn't stop just because your heart was shattered. She thought that would be the hardest thing. She hadn't met August yet. The town of Mill Haven had opinions about Clara Whitmore, and it shared them freely. The women at the dry goods store said it was a shame what happened to George, but that any sensible man could see it coming. A rancher who left everything to a daughter with no husband, no brothers, and no sense of her own limitations. The men at the feed store said the Whitmore land was good land, and it would be a pity to let it go to waste under a woman's management. Franklin Goss, who owned the biggest spread south of the county line and had been trying to buy George Whitmore's acreage for 11 years, said nothing at all. He just smiled with his teeth every time he saw Clara in town, the way a man smiles when he already knows how a card game is going to end. Clara noticed that smile. She had been noticing it since she was 14 years old. She hated it with a precision that surprised her sometimes. What the town of Mill Haven did not understand, what none of them could seem to wrap their comfortable minds around, was that Clara Whitmore had been running that ranch in all the ways that mattered for the past 3 years while her father's health declined. She had kept the books. She had managed the payroll. She had negotiated the cattle prices and caught the supply errors, and figured out that their previous hired hand, a man named Cutter, had been skimming feed money for the better part of a year. She had fired Cutter herself. He outweighed her by 100 pounds and had 20 years on her, and he'd laughed when she handed him his termination. She hadn't blinked. He left. But firing one dishonest hand was a different problem than facing a banknote, a drought, and a summer that showed no intention of cooling down. She had 3 remaining ranch hands: old Pete Grady, who was 61, and moved like his knees were arguments; young Davis Cole, who was 17 and enthusiastic but inexperienced; and a quiet Mexican man named Emilio Reyes, who was the most reliable of the 3, but had recently sprained his wrist badly enough that he couldn't swing a hammer for at least another 2 weeks. What Clara needed was a man who could work. What she got was Jackson Reed. He came in on a gray horse on a Tuesday, which she would later consider significant because nothing good had ever happened to her on a Tuesday before that one. She was at the water pump when she heard hoofbeats. She didn't look up immediately. Men passed through on their way to somewhere else all the time, and she had learned not to get hopeful over the sound of a horse. But the hoofbeats stopped. She looked up. He was tall in the saddle, the kind of tall that doesn't apologize for itself. Dark hair pushed back under a battered hat jaw, carrying 3 days of growth eyes that were doing a careful survey of the property with the practiced efficiency of a man who assessed broken things for a living. He was looking at her fence line. She knew what he saw. The same thing she saw: posts that needed resetting, wire that needed tightening, 2 sections near the north gate that needed replacing entirely. It was a fence that looked like it was tired. "You the owner?" he asked. His voice was even, not unfriendly, just direct, the way working men tended to be when they didn't have time or patience for the long way around a question. "I am," Clara said. He nodded like that was a reasonable answer, which she appreciated, because most men in Millhaven had spent the past 6 weeks looking at her like her ownership of anything was a temporary and slightly embarrassing situation. "Saw your notice at the feed store," he said. "Hiring on." She had posted a notice 4 days ago. 3 men had come to inquire. One left when he found out she was unmarried and the father was gone. One left when he heard about the banknote, apparently deciding a sinking ship wasn't worth his time. The third had tried to negotiate a rate so low it was barely an insult, which Clara suspected was intentional. She looked at this man on the gray horse and tried to take his measure the way her father had taught her. His clothes were worn but clean. His saddle was old but well maintained. His horse was calm and well kept, which told her something. A man who kept his horse in good condition in hard weather had a standard he held himself to. There was a rifle in his scabbard, but it sat the way a tool sat, not the way a weapon sat. Like it was there for practical purposes and nothing else. His hands, where they rested on the saddle horn, were what her father would have called honest hands. Scarred and calloused and capable looking. "What's your name?" she asked. "Jackson Reed." "Where are you coming from, Mr. Reed?" "Last job was down in Colorado. Before that, Kansas. Before that." He paused for just a moment. "Doesn't much matter where before that." Clara tilted her head. "You always skip over your history that fast." "Only the parts that don't help anybody." She almost smiled. Almost. She was too tired for a full smile and too careful to let a stranger see it anyway. "I've got fencing down a barn roof that won't survive another hard rain. 3 horses that need working, and a north pasture that needs rotating before the grass dies completely," she said. "The pay is fair, but not generous. The work is hard. I expect a full day of it. And I don't have patience for men who need managing." Jackson Reed looked at her steadily. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "That's all you've got to say. Seems like everything that needed saying got said." She studied him for one more moment. In her experience, men either talked too much or said nothing useful. This one seemed to land somewhere different, like he'd decided words were currency, and he wasn't in the habit of spending them carelessly. "You start tomorrow," she said. "There's a bunkhouse around the back. Pete will show you." She went back to the pump. She heard him dismount. Heard him lead the horse around the side of the building, talking to it in a low, quiet voice she couldn't make out. She didn't let herself watch. Jackson Reed worked like a man who had something to prove to himself rather than anyone else. That was the first thing Clara noticed 3 days in. Most hired hands performed their labor in a way that was visible. They wanted you to see them working, wanted you to notice the sweat and the effort, wanted credit for the difficulty. It was understandable enough. Hard work deserved acknowledgement. But Jackson didn't work like that. He worked like the fence was the only thing that mattered, and her opinion of his effort was an irrelevant variable. She would look out across the yard at 7 in the morning, and he would already be a quarter-mile out methodically moving down the fence line. She would check at midday, and he would have covered ground that should have taken 2 men twice as long. She would walk out at dusk to call them in for supper, and he would be finishing a section she hadn't even put on the week's list yet. "You don't have to work ahead of schedule," she told him on the 4th evening. He was washing up at the outdoor basin, sleeves rolled to the elbow. "I know," he said. "Then why?" "Because the fence past the north gate is worse than the rest," he said. "It's been poorly maintained for longer. If it comes down before I get to it, in order you lose cattle. Makes more sense to address the worst sections first and work backward. Clara blinked. I know that. I figured you did, he said, just explaining why I'm ahead. She stood there for a moment, slightly thrown. Men didn't usually assume she'd already done the calculation. They assumed she needed it explained. Fair enough, she said. She turned to go back inside. Miss Whitmore. She stopped. The barn roof, he said. The east section is worse than it looks from the ground. There's a rafter that's partially rotted. It'll need replacing, not just patching. I can have it done before the week's out, but I'll need additional lumber. I'll add it to the supply order, she said. Already wrote it down for you. He reached into his shirt pocket and held out a folded piece of paper. Neat handwriting. Exact measurements. A rough materials estimate. She took the paper. She looked at it. She looked at him. You worked construction, she asked. Among other things, he said. And that Clara was beginning to understand was as much as she was going to get out of Jackson Reed at any given time. Pete Grady liked him. This meant considerably more than it might have seemed. Pete Grady was 61 years old, had been working ranches since he was 13, and had developed over those 48 years a comprehensive and deeply held theory that most people were not worth the trouble they required. He made exceptions rarely grudgingly, and with evident suspicion that he'd regret it. He made an exception for Jackson Reed in less than a week. Clara overheard them talking at the breakfast table on a Sunday morning when she came in from the yard earlier than expected. Don't usually see a man your age without a place he's heading to. Pete was saying in his tone that sounded like simple observation, but was actually an extremely polite form of interrogation. Don't usually see a ranch this well organized with this much trouble on its hands, Jackson replied, which was not an answer, but was the kind of not answer that acknowledged the question. Pete was quiet for a moment. Clara heard the scrape of a fork. She's been carrying it alone since the spring, Pete said. George was sick, but he wouldn't admit it, and she didn't push him because she knew it would break him. So she just took it on, all of it. Clara pressed herself flat against the hallway wall and stopped breathing. She had not told anyone that. I know, Jackson said. How do you know? A pause. The accounts book, Jackson said. She keeps it in the office. I needed to check the supply figures. The handwriting changes. About 8 months ago, it goes from 2 styles to 1. Clara closed her eyes. He had noticed that. He had noticed that, and had understood exactly what it meant, and had said nothing about it to anyone, except Pete, in a private conversation he had no reason to think she could hear. She's going to lose the ranch, Pete said. It wasn't an accusation. It was the kind of statement old men made when they were trying to decide whether to feel something about it. Maybe, Jackson said. 30 days. I heard. That's not enough time. No, Jackson said. It's not. But it's more time than she had before this week. Pete was quiet. You're not just here for the fence work, he said finally. A long pause. The fence work needed doing, Jackson said. Clara walked back out to the yard before either of them could say anything else. She stood in the August sun with her arms crossed over her chest and her jaw set and her eyes burning in a way she refused to do anything about. She was not going to cry because a stranger had noticed her handwriting. She was absolutely not going to do that. She didn't. But it was a closer thing than she wanted to admit. The town showed up on Thursday. Not officially. Not as a group with a stated purpose. But Millhaven had its way of making its opinions felt, and one of its primary methods was the social call that wasn't really a social call. Edna Barlow came first, ostensibly to return a pie dish that Clara was fairly certain she'd never loaned her, with 2 other women trailing behind her like punctuation. They sat in Clara's kitchen and drank her tea and talked around what they'd actually come to say for 20 minutes, before Edna set down her cup and said, Franklin Goss has made an inquiry. Clara set down her own cup. Has he? He's willing to offer fair market value, Edna said in the tone of a woman delivering good news to someone too stubborn to recognize it. More than fair, some would say. He knows the land is in difficulty. He's trying to be generous. Franklin Goss, Clara said carefully, has been trying to buy this land since my father was alive and healthy, and told him no 11 years running. Now that my father is dead and I'm behind on a banknote, his generosity has arrived. Is that what we're calling it? Edna pressed her lips together. Clara, be reasonable. I am being extremely reasonable, Clara said. I'm running a ranch and managing a debt and holding a workforce together and trying to save land. My father built with his life. That is the definition of reasonable. What I will not do is sell to Franklin Goss, who has never done an honest thing in my presence. You don't have a choice. Thank you for returning the dish, Clara said, standing. I'll see you out. After they left, Clara stood in her kitchen for a long moment, hands flat on the table, breathing through her nose. Then she went out to the barn. Jackson was up in the rafters replacing the rotted beam. He didn't look down when she came in, but she could tell by the slight pause in his work that he registered her presence. Goss sent women to pressure me, she said, to no one in particular, or perhaps to the barn. A beat. Jackson said from the rafters. He wants to buy me out. I heard he might try something like that. She looked up. You heard? Small town. He resumed his work. The hammer fell in steady, even strokes. Saloon talk gets around. Men who work for Goss like to drink. And what do they say? Another pause. She could tell he was choosing words. That he's been patient a long time, Jackson said. That he considers the Whitmore land his eventually. The word eventually landed in her chest like something cold. It's not going to be, she said. The hammer stopped. Jackson looked down at her from the rafter. His expression was difficult to read, not closed exactly, but careful, like a man who'd learned to keep his reactions behind a door until he knew what to do with them. No, he said. I don't think it is. She didn't ask him what he meant by that. She didn't need to. 2 weeks into August. Clara discovered what Jackson Reed sent his money to. It wasn't an accident. She wasn't snooping. She was in the office working on accounts when she noticed that his pay had been drawn, but that he'd asked Pete to send it directly by post to an address in Pratt County, Kansas. That in itself wasn't unusual. Plenty of hands sent money home. But the amount he kept for himself was so small that she paused over the figure. She found Pete the next morning. The address Jackson sends his wages to, she said. What is that? Pete didn't look surprised that she'd noticed. Old man named Harlan Reed. Uncle. He raised the boy after his parents died. How old is he? Harlan. Near 80, I think. Can't work anymore. Bit of land but not much on it. Pete turned a piece of harness over in his hands. Jackson's been supporting him for, I'd guess, 8-10 years. Clara was quiet. He doesn't talk about it, Pete added. No, she said. He wouldn't. She walked back out into the yard and looked out at the east pasture where Jackson was moving with the horses, working a young mare that had been giving them trouble since spring. He moved around the animal with a patience that was almost physical, not forcing, not demanding, just offering a direction and waiting to see if it was accepted. She watched for longer than she meant to. Then she thought about a man who sent almost every dollar he earned to an old uncle in Kansas, who fixed things without being asked, who noticed her handwriting had changed and understood what that meant, who looked at Franklin Goss's operation and said eventually with a quiet flatness that was more threatening than any shout. She thought about a man who'd been wandering from ranch to ranch for years. And she wondered for the first time what it was he was wandering away from, or toward. Chang. He found her on the porch that night. She hadn't been able to sleep. The bank letter had been joined by a second correspondence from her father's former business associate, a man named Aldridge, who had apparently co-signed a secondary note that Clara had not known existed. The amount was not catastrophic, but it narrowed her margin to nearly nothing. She was sitting in the dark with the letter in her lap when she heard boots on the steps. She didn't startle. She'd heard his walk often enough by now to know it unhurried quiet, the step of a man who'd learned to move without announcing himself. Jackson stopped at the edge of the porch and looked out at the dark land. Can't sleep, he said. No. She didn't ask how he'd known to come out. It seemed beside the point. He was quiet for a moment. New problem. He nodded at the letter. My father had a secondary note I didn't know about. She said it flat, the way she'd learned to say bad things directly, without inflection, because inflection was where the grief snuck in. Aldridge. You know the name? No. He was a business partner of my father's years back. I didn't know he'd signed anything. She set the letter on the railing. I can cover it, barely, but it changes the timeline on the banknote. How much? She told him the figure. He didn't whistle, didn't react with the kind of theatrical concern that would have made her feel worse. He just absorbed it the way he absorbed most things, quietly, as if he was filing it in the right drawer. I might have a solution, he said. She looked at him. I know a cattle buyer out of Cheyenne, he said. Man named Foster. He's been looking to secure a regional contract, reliable source, guaranteed volume. If you could commit to a fall delivery of, he named a number. He'd pay premium rate. Front a portion in advance. Clara stared at him. You know a cattle buyer in Cheyenne, she said. Among other people, he said, which again was not an answer. Jackson. She turned to face him directly. The darkness made it easier somehow. Who are you? I was quiet for a moment. A man who's worked in a lot of places, he said. That is the least informative sentence I have ever heard. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. I used to do different work, he said. Before ranching, I moved cattle regionally. Contracts, logistics, transport. Worked for a firm in Denver for 3 years. Why did you stop? A pause. The firm went in a direction I wasn't willing to follow, he said, which told her something without telling her everything, and she was beginning to understand that was the most she was going to get, and that it probably said more in favor of him than against. Write to Foster, she said. Already drafted the letter, he said. Wanted your approval before I sent it. She looked at him for a long moment in the dark. You were going to ask me, she said. Not just do it. It's your ranch, he said. Like that was the simplest possible statement of fact. Clara picked up the bank letter, looked at it one more time, and set it down. Send it, she said. The response from Foster came back in 9 days. Jackson had been right about the terms. Better than right. Foster offered a contract that, combined with careful management of the remaining operating revenue, would cover both the banknote and Aldridge's claim, with enough left over to carry them through the winter with a modest cushion. Clara stood in the kitchen with the letter and read it 3 times. Then she sat down. Then she pressed both hands flat on the table and stared at the grain of the wood for a long moment, doing the thing she'd been trying not to do since June, letting herself feel the size of what had almost happened, and what apparently wasn't going to happen now. Well, Pete said from the doorway. We're going to make it, she said. Pete exhaled. It was a small sound from a man who didn't make big sounds, but it carried a weight of relief that she felt in her own chest. Jackson's out with the horses, Pete said. I know. She folded the letter, put it in her pocket, went to the window. She could see him in the east paddock working the young mare again. The horse was no longer a problem horse. In 2 weeks he had worked her from a panicked, unmanageable animal into something steady and willing entirely through patience and consistency, and the unwavering refusal to give up on what he'd started. She watched him for a moment. Then she went inside and started on supper. She made his favorite. She hadn't asked him what it was. She'd noticed. Twice in the past 2 weeks, he'd eaten the cornbread faster than anything else on the table, and once she'd caught him looking at the pot of coffee with an expression that was almost something warm when she'd added molasses to it on a cold morning. She made cornbread and smoked venison and the molasses coffee and called them in for supper. Jackson sat down across from her, and Pete and Davis and Emilio filled the rest of the table, and no one said very much because the work had been hard, and the day had been hot, and they were the kind of tired that made talking feel like an unnecessary expenditure. But halfway through the meal, Jackson looked up from his plate and met her eyes. She held out the letter. He took it, read it, set it down on the table between them. Good, he said. That was all. Good. She should have found it insufficient. She should have wanted more recognition, more expression, more acknowledgement of what the letter meant and what his role in it had been. But the way he said it, quiet and settled and certain like the resolution of something he had never doubted, made it feel like more than enough. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head once like the thanks were unnecessary. "It's your ranch," he said. Again. Like it was the only thing that mattered. She looked at him across the supper table in the cooling August evening with the letter that saved everything sitting between them, and something shifted in her chest that she did not have a name for yet. She filed it away. She was good at filing things away. But later that night, alone on the porch again, she took it back out and looked at it in the dark. A man who sent his money to an old uncle in Kansas. A man who fixed rafters before he was asked. A man who noticed her handwriting and said nothing. A man who had "it's your ranch" in him so completely that it came out as reflex. She sat in the dark for a long time. And somewhere across the yard in the bunkhouse a lamp burned past midnight. She told herself she didn't know whose it was. She knew. The lamp in the bunkhouse burned past midnight again. Clara knew because she was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table, with the accounts book open in front of her, a pencil in her hand, and numbers that finally added up the way they were supposed to. The foster contract had changed everything. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way a fever breaks gradually, then completely, and you realize you'd been so sick for so long that you'd forgotten what healthy felt like. She ran the column a third time. Same answer. They were going to make it through the winter. She set the pencil down. Outside through the window, the bunkhouse light flickered. She told herself she should go to bed. She didn't move. There was a thing happening in that space between the kitchen table and the bunkhouse window that Clara was not ready to name. She had managed these past 3 weeks to keep it at a professional distance. A thing she was aware of. The way you're aware of a sound in another room present, but not demanding attention. Jackson Reed worked for her. He had helped save her ranch. He was a decent, private, capable man who would one day ride on to another job and another broken thing that needed fixing, because that was what men like him did. She understood that. She believed it completely. She went to bed and lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling for an hour, and understood it completely the whole time. The trouble started on a Friday. Not the kind of trouble that announced itself. Not a letter, not a confrontation, not a man on a horse with bad news folded in his pocket. The kind of trouble that starts as something small and ordinary, and only later looking back do you understand? It was the first thread pulled on a thing that was going to unravel. It started with the water. The creek that fed the Whitmore North pasture, a reliable year-round source that had never given George Whitmore a moment of concern in 22 years of ranching, ran low. Not dry. But low enough that 3 days into August's second week, Jackson came to find Clara in the office with a look on his face that she'd learned to read, as there's something you need to know, and you're not going to like it. "Creek's dropping," he said. "How much?" "Enough. The cattle in the north pasture are drinking it down faster than it's replenishing." He crossed his arms, thinking. Could be the summer. Could be something upstream. "Something upstream," Clara repeated. "Could be," he said again, careful with the words. She looked at him. "Goss's property runs north of the creek's origin point," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She sat back in her chair. "You think he's diverting it?" Jackson was quiet for a moment. "I think the timing is interesting." The timing. A week after Edna Barlow had come to deliver Franklin Goss's offer. A week after Clara had turned it down flat and shown 3 women to the door. The timing was not interesting. The timing was a message written in the language of a man who'd been doing this kind of thing for long enough that he'd gotten elegant about it. "Can we prove it?" she asked. "Not yet. Then we deal with what we can prove." She stood smoothing her apron. "Move the cattle to the south pasture. It'll be crowded, but it'll do. And I want someone riding the north fence line every day. I want to know if anything else changes." "Already started the move this morning," he said. She stopped. "I figured you'd want it done," he said simply. She should have been irritated. He was making decisions on her land without her explicit authorization, and that was a thing that mattered to her, had always mattered to her, because the moment you let someone else make your decisions was the moment you stopped being the one in charge. But he hadn't made the decision. He'd started a precautionary action and then come immediately to inform her and defer to her judgment on everything else. It was the most precise execution of working for someone that she had ever encountered. "Thank you," she said. "Keep me informed." "Every day," he said and left. She stood in the empty office and listened to his boots on the porch steps and thought about a man who anticipated problems and solved them and asked for nothing and noticed everything. Then she went back to her numbers. Davis Cole was 17 and in love with everything, which made him both the most exhausting person on the ranch and occasionally the most useful. He was useful on a Saturday afternoon when he came back from town with feed supplies and a piece of information tucked under his arm like an afterthought. "Heard something at the feed store," he said to Jackson, who was resetting a post near the gate. He didn't bother lowering his voice. Davis had not yet developed the instinct for discretion. "Man from the county office was talking. Said there's been an application filed." Jackson kept working. "Application for what?" "Water rights." Davis hopped down from the wagon. "On the tributary that runs through the north section. The application names Goss's operation as primary claimant." The post went in. Jackson straightened, looked at Davis. "When was it filed?" he said. 2 weeks ago," Davis said. 2 weeks ago was the day after Clara had turned down Goss's offer. Jackson set down the mallet, picked up his hat, walked to the house. Clara was in the kitchen when he knocked on the doorframe. She looked up at his face and put down whatever she was holding. "Tell me," she said. He told her. She didn't react, not outwardly, not in the dramatic way that the news probably deserved. She went very still in the way she went still when something hit her hard. That absolute composure that he'd come to understand was not coldness, but its opposite. That it was what she did when the feeling was too big for an immediate reaction. "He filed it 2 weeks ago," she said. "Yes." "The day after I told Edna Barlow he could keep his offer." "Yes." "So this isn't about water rights?" "No," Jackson said. "It's about making you need him. Dry up the North Pasture file for the water rights so you can't work around it legally. Wait for the ranch to fail, without the water source, then come in with the offer again when you've got no other option." Clara was quiet. "How long does the application process take?" she said. "Typically 30 to 60 days. But a man with Goss's resources and connections could probably push it faster." "Who do I talk to?" "The county recorder's office. You can file a counterclaim as the downstream user existing use rights established water access. It won't block his application, but it puts you in the record as a prior claimant." He paused. "You'll want a lawyer." "I don't have money for a lawyer." "I know a man in Cheyenne," he said. "He handles land disputes. He works on contingency for cases he believes in." She looked at him for a long moment. "Jackson," she said slowly. "Ma'am." "How many people do you know?" Something moved across his face. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the nearest thing she'd seen. "I've worked a lot of places," he said. "So you keep saying." She stood. "Write to your man in Cheyenne. Tell him I need him here by the end of the week." She smoothed her apron again, the gesture she made when she was pulling herself together around a decision she'd already made. "I'm going to the county office Monday morning. I want the counterclaim filed before Goss has a chance to move things along." "I'll go with you," Jackson said. She looked at him. "If you want," he added. She held his gaze for just a second longer than was strictly necessary. 6 o'clock Monday, she said. "Don't be late." He wasn't. The county recorder's office smelled like old paper and warm wood, and the man behind the desk, a thin, slightly nervous individual named Mercer, looked at Clara Whitmore, the way men in official capacities often looked at her, which was to say with the specific expression of a person wondering who she was here on behalf of. "Mr. Mercer," Clara said, setting her folder of documents on his desk. "I'm here to file a counterclaim on water rights application number." She read him the number Davis had obtained. "Filed by Franklin Goss's Highline Cattle Operation against the tributary running through sections 12 through 14, Whitmore Creek Watershed." Mercer blinked. "You are?" "Clara Whitmore. I own the Whitmore Ranch established, 1869, which holds downstream access rights to that tributary predating Mr. Goss's presence in the county by 6 years. She opened the folder and produced 3 documents: survey record, original land patent, and a notarized record of continuous water use submitted by my father George Whitmore to the county in 1874 as part of a grazing rights review. Mercer looked at the documents. Then he looked at Jackson, who was standing slightly behind Clara's left shoulder, arms crossed. Jackson looked back at him. Mercer looked at Clara again. "I'll need to verify." "You're welcome to verify anything in that file," Clara said pleasantly. "I've included copies of each original record. The originals are in a secure location." She paused. "I'll also need a stamped receipt of filing. Today's date." Mercer reached for his stamp. Outside afterward, they stood in the street in the August heat, and Clara held the stamped receipt in both hands and looked at it without expression. "You had those documents already," Jackson said. "My father was meticulous," she said. "You knew this was coming." She looked up. "I knew Franklin Goss has been wanting this land for 11 years, and that he's been waiting for a moment of weakness. I didn't know exactly how he'd move, but I knew he'd move." She folded the receipt. "I've been keeping those documents organized for 3 years." Jackson looked at her. "You prepared for this before you even knew what it was," he said. "A woman running a ranch alone in this territory doesn't get to be unprepared," she said. Not bitterly, just factually the way she said most true things. He was quiet for a moment. "He's going to push harder when he sees this," he said. "I know. He's got money and connections, and he's used to getting what he wants when he waits long enough. I know that too." "You're not concerned." She looked at him levelly. "I'm terrified," she said. "And I'm not going to let that stop me from doing the next right thing." She tucked the receipt into her bag. "Let's go home." He noticed she said home, not back, and he didn't say anything about it, but something about it landed in him and stayed there quiet and warm, in a place he was trying to keep professionally empty. He failed somewhat at keeping it empty. The lawyer from Cheyenne arrived on a Wednesday. His name was Arthur Caldwell, and he was nothing like what Clara had expected from a man Jackson Reed knew. She had expected someone austere, perhaps someone dry and formal. Caldwell was 53, built like a former farmhand, and had a laugh that could rattle windows, which he deployed twice before he even sat down. But when he opened his case and looked at the documents Clara spread across the kitchen table, the laughter went away completely, and something sharp and focused came into his eyes. "This is good," he said after 20 minutes of silence. "This is very good, actually." He looked up. "Your father kept excellent records." "He believed the land would need to speak for itself one day," Clara said. "Smart man." Caldwell tapped one of the documents. "The 1874 Grazing Rights Review is particularly useful. It establishes continuous use before Goss's first land acquisition in the county. That matters significantly in territorial water law." He looked at her over his reading glasses. "I think you have a real case, Miss Whitmore. Not a guaranteed one Goss will bring resources, but a real one." "What do you need from me?" Clara asked. "Testimony. Documentation of the recent reduction in flow, and any evidence, even circumstantial, of upstream interference." He glanced at Jackson. "Your man here can be useful on that front. If there's diversion happening, someone's done the work. Work leaves traces." "I'll ride up to the origin point," Jackson said. "Don't trespass on Goss's land," Caldwell said immediately. "I wasn't planning to," Jackson said. "Good." Caldwell looked at him steadily. "I heard your name before I came out here, Mr. Reed." Jackson met his eyes, said nothing. "You have history with regional operations," Caldwell said. "Not a question." "Some," Jackson said. "The firm in Denver." Clara went very still. She didn't look at Jackson. Jackson was quiet for a moment. "I left that position." "I know you did," Caldwell said. "I also know why." He held Jackson's gaze for one more beat. "That's going to be relevant if Goss's people do any digging on who's been helping Miss Whitmore." "Then I'll make sure they don't find anything useful," Jackson said. Caldwell nodded once like that settled something. Clara waited until Caldwell had excused himself to look over the property before she turned to Jackson. "The firm in Denver," she said. "Clara, you said they went in a direction you weren't willing to follow." He was quiet. "What direction?" she said. A long pause, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down at the table, forearms on the surface, and looked at his hands the way a man looks at something he's made peace with but doesn't enjoy examining. "The firm ran cattle transport contracts," he said. "Legitimate work. Moving herds regionally, brokering sale contracts. I was good at it." He paused. 3 years and the owner started taking on additional clients. Men who needed cattle moved or product moved using cattle as cover. Clara was very still. "Contraband," she said, "among other things. I didn't know for the first year. By the time I understood what was happening, I'd been in the middle of it long enough that leaving was complicated." He met her eyes. "I left anyway, handed everything I knew to a federal man and walked." "You turned them in," she said. "It was the right thing to do." "Did they know it was you?" "Yes. And I left Denver, and I've been moving ever since." He said it without self-pity, just simply like a man reading coordinates on a map. "It's been 3 years. The principals were convicted. The firm is gone. But men who lose everything because of one person's testimony don't always let go of that cleanly." Clara sat with that for a moment. "So you've been keeping yourself small," she said. "Staying off the main roads, coming through places like Millhaven." "There are worse places than Millhaven," he said. She looked at him. "Jackson," she said carefully, "are you in danger?" He considered it with what she now recognized as his characteristic honesty, not minimizing, not dramatizing. "Less than I was," he said, "but not never." "And you came here anyway. You stayed." "The fence needed fixing," he said. She stared at him. He held her gaze, and for a moment in the quiet kitchen, with the afternoon heat pressing in through the window, and Arthur Caldwell's boots audible on the porch outside, she understood something that she would spend the next several days pretending she hadn't understood. This man had not come through Millhaven by accident. He had stayed not because of the fence or the barn or the foster contract. He had stayed because something about this place about her had made him want to stop moving, and he didn't know what to do with that any more than she did. Goss made his next move on a Thursday evening. Not the water, not the bank. Something else entirely, and much cleverer, which told Clara he'd been watching and calculating and had decided that the direct approach wasn't working. He sent a man. Not one of his regular hands. A man in a proper suit with a card that said, "Gerald Hatch, Attorney at Law, Casper, Wyoming." He arrived just before supper and asked very politely to speak with Miss Whitmore about a matter of some legal delicacy. Clara met him on the porch. Jackson was on the porch too, repairing a hinge on the screen door, which he had not mentioned, needing repair before that moment. He did not introduce himself. He did not look up from his work. He simply existed at the edge of the conversation in a way that was entirely unhurried and completely immovable. Hatch looked at him once, looked at Clara, proceeded. "Miss Whitmore, I represent Mr. Goss in several ongoing legal matters." He produced a document. "I've been authorized to present you with a revised offer for the Whitmore property. Given the current uncertainty around the water rights situation and the general market conditions for operating ranches in this county, Mr. Goss believes this figure reflects a fair assessment of current value." He held out the paper. Clara took it, looked at the number. The number was lower than the previous offer. She looked up. "He's reducing his offer," she said. "Market conditions. He filed for my water rights, waited 2 weeks, and is now presenting a lower offer as though the reduction in value is a coincidence." She handed the paper back. "Tell Mr. Goss I'm not interested. Miss Whitmore, I want to be candid with you." Hatch's voice shifted, still professional, but with a new weight in it. "The water rights application is likely to succeed. Mr. Goss has a strong case and significant resources behind it. Without that water source, the north pasture becomes unusable. Your operating capacity drops by." "I'm aware of my own property's operating capacity," Clara said. Then you're aware that without a resolution, the banknote situation becomes significantly more difficult to manage, even with... He paused, a small, careful pause. Outside assistance. The hinge gave a sharp, clean click. Everyone looked at Jackson. He had seated the hinge perfectly and was now testing the door's swing with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had just finished a task and was in no hurry at all. He looked up, met Hatch's eyes, said nothing. Hatch looked back at Clara. The offer expires in 1 week, he said. Then it will expire, Clara said. After he left, Pete appeared from around the corner of the house. He had clearly been there for some portion of the conversation, because Pete Grady had been running his own quiet intelligence operation on the Whitmore property for 30 years, and old habits didn't die. Low offer, Pete observed. 40% below his first number, Clara said. He's squeezing. He thinks he can. She folded her arms. He's wrong. Pete looked at Jackson. Jackson looked at Pete. Some communication happened between the two of them that did not require words, which Clara decided to find irritating, but secretly found reassuring. What are we going to do about the creek? Pete asked. Jackson is riding to the origin point tomorrow, she said. If there's diversion work happening, I want evidence. I'll go with him, Pete said. Good. They found it. Not trespass, not anything. They couldn't stand behind in a courtroom. They stayed on the county access road and the ridge above it, which was public land. And they brought a surveying glass and Davis Cole's very good eyes. It was a diversion dam. Small, recent, deliberately placed on a natural narrowing of the tributary where the flow could be redirected with minimal infrastructure. It wasn't on Goss's deeded property. It was on a disputed strip, a section whose ownership had never been clearly resolved in the county records, which suggested that Goss or someone working for him had done their research. But it was new, and it was man-made. And Jackson had the eye of someone who'd spent years reading land use patterns, and he mapped it and noted it and wrote down every relevant detail in the precise measured handwriting that Clara had first noticed on a materials list for a barn roof. When they brought it back to Caldwell, the lawyer looked at the notes for a long time. This changes things, he said. How much? Clara asked. The application claims natural water rights based on upstream origination. If the flow reduction is the result of artificial diversion, even on disputed land, that undermines the application significantly. It moves this from a water rights dispute to a potential interference claim. He looked at the notes again. I can work with this. Will it hold? Jackson asked. In front of the right judge, yes. Caldwell looked up. I need to make some inquiries about which judge is likely to hear this. Goss has influence with the county bench, Clara said. I know. I'm thinking about a different venue. He smiled just briefly. Federal land grant disputes can be escalated. If I can make the argument that this involves the original patent, take it to federal court, Clara said. It's a longer road. It's my road, she said. Take it. The night before Caldwell was due to file the escalated claim, Clara couldn't sleep again. She was getting tired of not sleeping. She was a person who had always slept soundly, who had always been able to set her troubles outside her bedroom door, like muddy boots, and pick them up again in the morning, rested and equipped. This summer had taken that from her. She was on the porch, her chair, her August dark, when she heard boots on the steps. She didn't startle. You need to stop doing that, she said. Doing what? Jackson sat down on the step, forearms on his knees. Knowing when I'm out here. The light in the kitchen goes out, then nothing else does, he said. Not complicated. She looked at him. You've been watching my windows. I've been noting when things that should be dark aren't. That's the same thing. It's a different thing entirely, he said, and something in his voice was so precisely balanced between serious and not serious that she couldn't decide which one he meant. She looked out at the dark. I keep running the numbers, she said. And they work. They work every time. I know they work. She pressed her lips together. I still can't sleep. He was quiet for a moment. I used to have a ranch, he said. She went very still. Not big, not like this, A few years before Denver, down in New Mexico. He looked at his hands. I'd saved for 4 years to buy the parcel. Thought I was done moving. A pause. A man with more money and more connections decided he wanted it. Not because it was worth what he paid, not because he needed it. Just because it was there, and I had it, and he'd decided he wanted it. Clara said nothing. She felt the weight of what he was telling her. I didn't fight it, he said. I was young, and I didn't know how, and I didn't have anyone who knew what you know, the documents, the records, the law. Another pause. I took what he offered, and I left, and I spent 2 years after that angry enough to be dangerous. Is that why you ended up at the firm in Denver? She said. Partly. And why you turned them in when you found out what they were? He looked at her. Because by then I'd become something I recognized, he said slowly. Someone taking what belonged to other people and calling it business. Clara held that for a moment. You're not that person, she said. No, he agreed. But I remember how easy it was to start becoming him. He turned to look at her directly. You're not going to lose this ranch, Clara. It was the first time he had said her name without the miss. She noticed. She was almost certain he noticed that she noticed. You don't know that, she said, but her voice came out quieter than she intended. I know you filed those documents before I ever rode in, he said. I know you let me help, but you never handed me the wheel. I know you looked Hatch in the eye and handed his paper back without blinking. He paused. You're going to fight Goss, and you're going to win, and then you're going to run this ranch for another 30 years and make your father proud. She pressed her lips together hard. Don't, she said low. Don't what? Don't say things like that to me right now. I'm very tired and I'm doing my best not to. She stopped. Not to what? He said very quietly. The August night sat between them. A long silence. I don't know, she said, which was a lie so obvious she was almost embarrassed by it. Jackson looked at her for a moment. Then he stood, picked up his hat and said, Get some sleep, Clara. Tomorrow's a long day. He walked back across the yard. She watched him go. She stayed on the porch for another hour. And when she finally went inside and lay down in the dark, she did not think about the banknote, or the water rights, or the federal claim, or Franklin Goss. She thought about a man who had once had a ranch and lost it, and never stopped being the kind of man who deserved one. And she thought about how somewhere in the past 3.5 weeks she had stopped thinking of the Whitmore Ranch as a thing she was trying to save. She had started thinking of it as a thing she was trying to build. For the first time she wondered if she was the only one thinking that. She didn't sleep for another hour. But when she finally did, she slept soundly. Caldwell filed the escalated claim on a Friday morning, and by Friday afternoon all of Millhaven knew about it. That was the thing about small towns, that Clara had grown up understanding information didn't travel through them so much as detonate. One person knew, then 10 people knew. Then the thing you'd done in a county office at 9 in the morning was being discussed over supper tables by people who hadn't been within 3 miles of it. By Saturday she knew the town had taken sides. Not publicly. Not in any way that required courage or commitment. But in the small, legible ways that small towns communicated allegiance, who nodded to her at the dry goods store, and who suddenly found something interesting to examine on a shelf when she walked past. Who waved from across the street, and who turned a shoulder. Millhaven had decided this was a contest, and a fair portion of it had decided that Franklin Goss was the safer bet. Clara bought her supplies, smiled at the people who smiled at her, and did not give the others the satisfaction of her attention. She was loading the wagon when she heard it. 2 men outside the feed store, voices low, but not low enough. She caught the words, foolish woman, and won't last the season, and something about how Goss was a patient man, and patient men tended to get what they wanted eventually. She kept loading. Her jaw was tight enough to ache. You hear that? Davis said, appearing at her elbow, young face flushed and indignant. Load the feed, she said. But they said, I heard what they said, Davis. She set a sack in the wagon without looking at him. Load the feed. He did. But she could feel the anger coming off him in waves, the particular outrage of a 17-year-old who hadn't yet learned that the most devastating response to people who underestimate you is to succeed quietly while they're still talking. She'd learned it at 14. It didn't make it easier to hear. It just made it easier to keep moving. What she hadn't expected was Jackson at the feed store door. He'd come into town separately, something about a part he needed for the pump mechanism, and she hadn't seen him until she turned with the last sack and found him standing at the edge of the boardwalk, looking at the two men who'd been talking. He wasn't doing anything. I was just standing there looking at them with the particular quality of stillness that she'd come to understand was not passivity, but its opposite. The stillness of a man who had made a decision and was waiting to see if it needed to be acted on. The two men had gone quiet. One of them found something to do with his boots. The other looked away first. Jackson turned, saw Clara watching him, and walked to the wagon like nothing had happened. "Get what you needed?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and climbed up to take the reins. She sat beside him on the bench, and they drove out of Millhaven in silence, and she thought about a man who hadn't said a word, hadn't moved a muscle, hadn't done anything at all, and had somehow said everything. "You didn't have to do that," she said about a mile out. "Do what?" he said. She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road. "Thank you," she said. "Load's shifting in the back," he said. "Davis didn't tie it right." She almost laughed. Almost. The letter arrived on Tuesday. Not from Caldwell. Not from the court. From a man named Holt out of Denver. And when Clara saw the return address, she felt nothing particular because she didn't recognize the name. Jackson went very still when she read it aloud at the breakfast table. She noticed. She kept reading. The letter was cordial in the way that threatening letters often were formally polite, carefully worded, concerned in its language with business matters and the resolution of certain outstanding professional disagreements. It referenced Jackson by name. It referenced the Whitmore Ranch by name. It expressed with considerable courtesy the hope that Mr. Reed's current situation would not become unnecessarily complicated by his continued involvement in county legal disputes that might attract federal attention. She set the letter down. The table was quiet. Pete was looking at his coffee. Davis was looking at Jackson. Emilio had gone very still in the way Emilio went still when something serious was happening that he was not sure was his business. "Holt," Clara said. "Former associate," Jackson said. His voice was level. "From Denver. One of the principals. He was convicted, served 18 months. Apparently he's out." Clara looked at the letter again. "He knows you're here. He knows I'm somewhere in Wyoming." A beat. "He didn't know which town until this letter was sent." "So now he knows which town?" "Yes." Clara picked up the letter, walked to the stove, and fed it to the fire. She turned around. "We continue," she said. Jackson looked at her. "Clara, is this man dangerous?" she said. A pause. "He's the kind of man who sends letters rather than men. So cautious, but capable of escalation if he's pressured." "Is he connected to Goss?" Jackson was quiet for a moment, in a way that was not quite a hesitation, but was close enough to make her pay attention. "I don't know," he said slowly. "I don't know that they're connected. But they're the same kind of man, and that kind of man tends to find each other." Pete set down his coffee cup. "You think Goss went looking?" "I think it's possible someone told Goss there was a man helping Clara fight him, and Goss went looking for leverage," Jackson said. "And Holt's the kind of man who sells information." The kitchen was quiet. Clara crossed her arms. "So Goss may know your history?" "Possibly." "And he may try to use it?" "Possibly." "To do what? Discredit you as a witness, have Caldwell's case undermined by association." "That would be the sophisticated play," Jackson said. "Then we make sure Caldwell knows before Goss can use it as a surprise," she said. "We tell him everything, today." Jackson looked at her. "You understand that means—" "It means your past becomes part of the record," she said. "Yes, I understand." She met his eyes. "It also means that the fact that you cooperated with federal authorities, turned in a criminal enterprise, and chose honesty over self-interest becomes part of the record, which I would think reflects rather well on your character." Something moved across his face. Quick and then gone, but she caught at something that looked like a man being seen in a way he hadn't prepared for. "Send for Caldwell," she said. "Afternoon if he can make it." She walked out of the kitchen. "Butter?" she heard Pete say quietly in the tone of a man annotating something he'd always suspected. "She doesn't do anything small, does she?" She didn't hear Jackson's response, but she heard Pete laugh low and genuine for the first time since June. Caldwell took the information about Holt, the way he took most difficult information, without visible alarm, with considerable speed of processing, and with an immediate pivot to tactical implications. "It's not ideal," he said, "but manageable. Goss's strategy, if he has one, would be to introduce your past at the hearing as a way to question the credibility of testimony supporting Miss Whitmore's claim. The counter to that is simple. We introduce it ourselves, framed correctly." He looked at Jackson. A man who risked his livelihood and his safety to cooperate with federal authorities against a criminal enterprise is not a man whose credibility is easy to attack. "He'll try anyway," Jackson said. "He'll try. We'll be ready." Caldwell made a note. "I need a complete account. Everything. Names, dates, what you knew, when you knew it, what you did." He looked up. "All of it." "All right," Jackson said. "Today if possible." "All right." Clara stood to leave. "Stay," Caldwell said. She stopped. "If Goss goes after Reed's credibility, he may go after yours as well," Caldwell said. "The nature of your working relationship, the degree to which you relied on his counsel. All of that becomes relevant if he tries to paint this as an outside manipulation of a vulnerable woman's property." Clara sat back down. "I am not a vulnerable woman," she said. "I know that," Caldwell said. "A judge may need to be convinced." She looked at him steadily. "What do you need from me?" "The same thing. Everything." He settled his papers. "Let's start from the beginning." They sat at her kitchen table for 4 hours. By the end of it, Caldwell knew the entire shape of the summer. The banknote, the drought, the foster contract, the water diversion, the Holt letter, and every decision Clara and Jackson had made between them. He asked precise questions and received precise answers, and made notes with the rapid efficiency of a man who'd been doing this for 30 years. At one point he paused and looked at both of them. "You two make decisions the way a partnership does," he said. "Not a question, an observation." Neither of them answered. Caldwell went back to his notes. "I'll have a full case strategy ready by Thursday." Goss moved first on a Wednesday. The move was elegant in its nastiness, not a legal action, not a direct confrontation, but something that functioned in the space between. He called in a favor from a man on the county loan committee, and that man made an informal inquiry to the First Territorial Bank regarding the Whitmore note, suggesting that the bank might wish to review the terms given certain ongoing complications surrounding the property's operational status. It wasn't illegal. It was the kind of thing that powerful men did when they were running out of patience. Not a frontal attack, but a tap on the shoulder, a quiet word, a reminder that there were people in this county whose goodwill was worth more than one woman's land. The bank sent a representative the next morning. His name was Graves, and he came with the apologetic bearing of a man delivering news he'd prefer not to deliver, but had been clearly instructed to deliver. Clara met him on the porch. Jackson was somewhere behind her. She could feel it without looking, that particular quality of his presence, steady and quiet, like a thing you could lean on without it moving. She did not lean, but she did not hate knowing it was there. "Miss Whitmore," Graves said, "I want to be candid with you." "Please," she said. "The bank has received some concerns about the stability of the current operating situation here. Given the ongoing legal dispute and the uncertainty around the water rights, there's been a suggestion that the terms of the note may need to be revisited." "Revisited," she said. "Specifically, there's been a proposal to accelerate the repayment rather than the original 30 days. 2 weeks, she said. "I want you to know this didn't originate with the bank itself." "I know exactly where it originated," Clara said. "And I want you to know something, Mr. Graves." She reached into her apron pocket and produced 2 documents. The first is the foster contract, which secures advance payment sufficient to satisfy the note in full. It was signed 12 days ago. She held it out. Graves took it blinking. The second is a counterclaim filed with the county recorder's office on the water rights dispute, supplemented by a federal escalation submitted by my attorney Arthur Caldwell on Friday. She held that out too. If the bank has concerns about the stability of this operation, I would encourage a careful review of those materials before making any decisions that could later be characterized as made under external influence. Graves looked at the documents. He looked up at her. He looked briefly past her. She didn't look back. She already knew what he was seeing. "I'll take these back to the bank," he said. "Please do," Clara said. "I'll expect to hear that the original terms stand by end of week." After he left, she stayed on the porch for a moment, perfectly still, and let the adrenaline move through her like a wave. Jackson stepped up beside her. "You had the Foster contract in your apron pocket," he said. "Since Monday," she said. "I figured someone would come." A pause. "You figured Goss would push the bank," he said. "The water rights push didn't work the way he wanted. The letter to you didn't work. The low offer didn't work." She folded her arms. "Men like Goss don't stop. They escalate." She looked at the road Graves had come down. "I've been waiting for the next move since the day we filed with Caldwell." Jackson was quiet. "Clara," he said. "Don't," she said the same way she'd said it on the porch that night, quiet and meaning something more than the word itself. He stopped. A beat. "You should have been a lawyer," he said. She almost laughed. "My father said the same thing." She turned to go inside. "I preferred the land." The bank confirmed the original terms by Thursday afternoon. Caldwell's strategy paper arrived the same day. 12 pages. Meticulous, outlining the case structure for the federal hearing and the specific arguments that would neutralize a credibility attack on Jackson's testimony. Clara read every page twice. Jackson read it once and asked one question which was precise enough that Caldwell, when she relayed it, said that's the right question and revised a section. By Thursday evening, Clara was beginning to believe carefully, not yet fully the way you test ice before you trust your weight to it, that they might actually win. She was at the desk in the office when Jackson knocked. "Come in," she said. He came in, stayed near the doorway. He did that, kept the exit in arm's reach in a room that wasn't his, which she'd come to understand was habit more than discomfort. "I need to tell you something," he said. She set down her pen. His expression was the one she'd come to know as, "This is going to be difficult, and I'm going to say it anyway." Not closed, not braced, just honest in the way he was honest about hard things directly and without decoration. "Holt has someone in the county," he said. "I found out this afternoon. A man named Carver, he's been asking about me in town, at the saloon at the livery, asking how long I've been here, what I do, who I work for." Clara was very still. "Goss sent Holt's man to gather information. Or Holt sent him independently. Either way, he's here, and he's been talking to people, and at least 2 of those people are the kind who'll tell him anything he wants to know if it benefits them." She thought about the men outside the feed store, about Edna Barlow's social calls, about the way a small town made its allegiances visible. "How much does he know?" she asked. "Enough," Jackson said. "My name, how long I've been here, the nature of what I've been doing." A pause. "He probably knows about Denver." "So Goss knows. By tomorrow morning if he doesn't already." She was quiet for a moment. The lamp threw long shadows, and the night outside the window was very dark, and she was tired, in a way she hadn't let herself acknowledge before now. Not physical tired, but the deep tired of a person who has been managing one crisis after another for months without setting anything down. "What does that change?" she said. "It changes the hearing," he said. "If Goss's people show up with Holt's documentation on my past Caldwell strategy, depends on us having gotten ahead of it first. If they got to the judge before we did they? I don't know." She stood. "Then we find out." She picked up her pen and a piece of paper. "Write down everything Carver has asked about. Everyone he talked to. I want a complete picture before I go to Caldwell in the morning." Jackson crossed to the desk. She slid the paper toward him. He picked up the pen she'd set down and started writing. They worked side by side in the lamplight, and it felt so natural, so simply dangerously natural that neither of them remarked on it. She was very aware of how close he was standing. She was almost certain he was aware of it too. Caldwell took the news about Carver without missing a beat. "It accelerates the timeline," he said, "but it doesn't change the outcome if we move correctly." He folded his hands. "I need to request an expedited hearing date. That requires a showing of urgency. I can make that argument based on the ongoing interference with your water source and the recent banking pressure." He looked at Clara. "I need you in front of that judge before Goss has a chance to file any kind of preemptive motion." "How fast?" she said. 10 days, maybe 7 if I push." "Push," she said. He left within the hour. The day after the man named Carver showed up at the Whitmore ranch. He didn't come to the house. He came to the gate, sat on his horse, and asked Pete, who had gone to see who was there, if he could speak to the man called Jackson Reed. Pete came to find Clara. Clara went to the gate. Carver was younger than she'd expected. Mid-20s slight, with the specific watchfulness of a man who'd been trained to observe. He looked at Clara with an expression that recalibrated quickly. He'd expected someone different, or no one, or a man. "Miss Whitmore," he said, which meant he knew who she was. "My gate," she said. "My property. Whatever business you have here, you have it with me." Carver looked at her for a moment. "I was hoping to speak to—" "I heard what you were hoping," she said. "I'm telling you what's going to happen instead. If you have a message for anyone on this property, you leave it with me. In writing. And then you ride back to whoever sent you, and you tell them that this ranch is not interested in conversations that don't go through proper channels." He looked at her steadily. "Mr. Holt sends his regards," he said. "How kind," she said. "Goodbye, Mr. Carver." He held her gaze for one more moment, trying to find something in her face. She thought some crack or uncertainty he could report back. He didn't find it because she didn't let him. He turned his horse and left. She went back to the house. Jackson was on the porch. He'd been there since Pete came to find her, she realized, standing at the edge watching. "He have anything useful?" he asked. "He wanted to rattle you," she said. "I didn't let him see you." Jackson looked at her. "You—" He stopped. "He was here to take your measure," she said. "I didn't see any reason to let him." She went to the door. "Supper in an hour." She went inside. She heard him exhale slow and long behind her. The hearing date came through on a Saturday. 8 days. Caldwell sent word with a note that said simply, "Expedited granted. Be ready. AC." Clara read the note at the breakfast table and passed it to Jackson without comment. He read it, set it down. 8 days, he said. 8 days, she confirmed. Pete poured himself more coffee. "We going to be ready?" "We're going to be ready," Clara said. That was the end of that conversation, because on the Whitmore Ranch in August of 1887, being ready was not a question. It was a decision you made, and then you went and made it true. What she didn't say at the table, what she carried alone through the rest of that day and into the night, was the thing that Caldwell had told her privately at the end of their last meeting, in the quiet moment when Jackson had stepped out to speak to Pete. "Goss has filed a counter motion," Caldwell had said. "He's challenging your ownership standing, not the water rights your ownership. He's claiming that your father's debt structure at the time of his death constitutes a constructive transfer of interest to the creditor, which he happens to have acquired." She had looked at him. "He bought the debt," she said. "He bought the secondary note," Caldwell said. "The Aldridge note, which means he's not just fighting you for the water. He's arguing he has partial ownership standing in the property itself." She had been very quiet. "Can he make that argument?" she said. "He can make it. Whether it holds—" Caldwell had paused. "It's going to depend on the hearing, on the judge, on the case we build." "Can we build it?" Caldwell had looked at her with the expression of a man who'd been in enough fights to know the difference between a bad position and a losing one. "Yes," he said. "But Clara, I need you to understand that this is no longer just a water rights dispute. Goss is going after the land itself." She had understood. She hadn't told Jackson. She didn't know exactly why she hadn't told him. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't protective. It was something more personal and less logical. A thing she was carrying alone because she needed to know if she could, because the summer had taught her that knowing you could carry something was different from having to have someone carry it for you. But that night on the porch alone in the dark, the weight of it settled into her in a different way. Goss wasn't just trying to buy her out anymore. I was trying to take what was hers by finding a legal door she didn't know existed. He had bought her father's debt and turned it into a weapon, and the hearing in 8 days was not going to be a water rights case. It was going to be a fight for the Whitmore ranch itself. She sat in the dark, and she thought about her father's hands on the fence post. She thought about the accounts book with the handwriting that changed. She thought about 3 years of quietly, stubbornly, completely running a ranch, while everyone around her decided she couldn't. She was not going to lose this land. She was not going to lose it. She heard boots on the steps. She didn't say anything this time, just moved over slightly on the bench. Jackson sat down beside her, not close, just beside her. Close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cool night. They sat in silence for a while. "He bought the Aldridge note," she said. A pause. Long enough that she knew he'd already known. "When did you find out?" she asked. "Yesterday," he said. "Caldwell told me when you stepped out." She processed that. "You didn't tell me." "You didn't tell me either," he said. "I was waiting to see if you needed—" "I don't need." "I know you don't need," he said, and his voice was so precisely calibrated between gentle and direct that it cut through her defenses completely. "I was waiting to see if you wanted." She stopped. The night was very quiet. "He's going for the land," she said. "Yes." "Caldwell thinks we can stop it." "Caldwell's right," he said. "You sound very certain." "I am," he said. "Because you've been 3 steps ahead of this man since the day I got here, and you had those documents filed before any of this started, and you just spent the last 3 weeks building a case that a judge with any integrity is going to see clearly." He paused. "And because I'm not going to let you do it alone." Clara looked at the dark land. Her land. Her father's land. The land she'd reset fence posts on in the middle of the night, crying so hard she couldn't see. "Jackson," she said. "Yeah. I should probably tell you something." "All right." She turned and looked at him directly in the dark, the way it was easier to say true things when you couldn't quite see the consequences of saying them. "I am very glad you rode in on that Tuesday," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Me too," he said. They sat there in the August dark side by side, neither of them moving closer, and neither of them moving away. 8 days. Whatever came next, she was not facing it alone. And somewhere in the space between that certainty and the warmth beside her on the bench, something she had been filing away all summer finally refused to stay filed. She didn't say anything about it, but she stopped pretending it wasn't there. The 8 days moved the way hard days always did, too fast and too slow at once, each one carrying more weight than the one before it. Clara slept better than she had all summer. She couldn't explain it and didn't try. There was something about having the whole shape of the danger visible that made it easier to carry than the months of not knowing which direction it would come from. Goss had shown his hand. He'd bought the Aldridge note, filed the counter-motion, sent Carver to take measure, pressed the bank, dried up the creek. He had done everything a man like him could do from a comfortable distance. Now it was going to a judge. And Clara Whitmore had Arthur Caldwell 3 years of meticulous documentation, a signed cattle contract, and a federal escalation that was already drawing attention from a land office in Cheyenne. She also had Jackson Reed, which she was still learning how to account for on the ledger. Caldwell came out to the ranch on a Monday, 4 days before the hearing, to run through testimony. He sat Clara at the kitchen table and walked her through every question Goss's lawyer would likely ask, and then he walked her through them again from a different angle, and then he said, "Now answer the same questions as though you're angry," and watched how her answers changed, and told her which version was more credible. She was not, it turned out, more credible when she was angry. She was more credible when she was exact. "Don't let them make you defend yourself," Caldwell said. "The moment you're defending, you're losing ground. Answer the question that was asked. No more, no less. I know how to answer questions, she said. I know you do, he said. I'm telling you anyway, because in a courtroom knowing and doing are two different skills. She took it without argument, because he was right. Jackson's testimony session was different. Caldwell took him through the Denver years with the systematic precision of a man who knew exactly which rocks to turn over before an opposing lawyer could, and wanted to make sure there were no surprises underneath them. Jackson answered everything directly and without elaboration, in the same steady voice he used for everything, and Caldwell made notes and occasionally said good in the tone of a man who meant it. Clara sat at the far end of the table and listened to the whole of it. The firm, the contracts, the realization, the federal cooperation, the years since. She already knew most of it. But hearing it laid out in full in order, in the careful language of legal testimony, she understood something she hadn't quite articulated before. This man had lost everything once for doing the right thing. And he'd come to Millhaven, Wyoming, and done it again. She didn't say that at the table. She filed it in the place where she kept the things she wasn't ready to speak aloud yet. Next to the warmth from the porch bench and the sound of her name without the miss in front of it. It was getting crowded in that place. Tuesday brought two things. The first was a writer from Cheyenne, a young man from the Federal Land Office, official enough to have a printed credential, who arrived with a letter confirming that the escalated water rights claim had been accepted for federal review. It didn't resolve anything immediately. But it meant that any ruling at the county level would be subject to federal oversight, which significantly reduced Goss's ability to use local influence to tilt the outcome. Caldwell. When Clara sent him word, wrote back 3 words. Excellent. Stay ready. The second thing was Pete Grady, who came to the office in the late afternoon with his hat in his hands, which was how Pete indicated that something serious was about to be said. Sit down, Pete, she said. He sat. I've been hearing things in town, he said. From men who work Goss's south fence line. They talk at the saloon. He turned his hat in his hands. Goss has been putting it around that when he wins the hearing, he's planning to restructure the whole north section. Run his cattle across the Whitmore land under an easement claim. A pause. And that he intends to make an offer to the hands here. Anyone who wants to stay on when the property transfers. Clara was quiet. He's telling people it's already over, she said. Yes, ma'am. He's trying to shake the crew. That's my thinking, Pete said. Davis heard it too. He's upset about it. Another pause. Emilio just wants to know what's true. She stood. Call them in, all of them. Pete went. 10 minutes later, all 4 of her hands were standing in the kitchen, Pete with his hat still in his hands, Davis with his jaw set in that teenage way that meant he was trying to look older than he felt. Emilio quiet and watchful, and Jackson in the doorway, leaning against the frame, arms crossed. Clara stood at the head of the table. I know what's being said in town, she said. I want to tell you what's true. The hearing is in 3 days. We have strong documentation, a solid legal strategy, and federal oversight on the water rights claim. I believe we're going to win. She looked at each of them in turn. But I can't promise it, and I won't. What I can tell you is that whatever you've heard about Goss's plans for this property is exactly what it sounds like, a man counting chickens before they're his to count. Davis said, he told Mick Coulter's boy that he's already got a foreman picked out. He can pick whoever he likes, Clara said. He doesn't own this land. What if the judge, Davis? Her voice was gentle but final. I'm not going to stand in my own kitchen and plan for losing. I'm going to plan for winning. That's what I need from all of you too. She paused. If any of you have decided this isn't a fight worth staying in, I understand it. You can go and I won't think less of you, but I need to know now. Silence. Pete put his hat back on. I've been working this land for 30 years, he said. I ain't leaving it to Franklin Goss. Emilio said quietly and precisely. I stay. Davis said, I'm not going anywhere, with the particular fervor of a 17-year-old who had just decided something permanent about himself. Jackson said nothing. She looked at him. He looked back at her. I'll have the south fence line done before the hearing, he said. Like that was the answer to the question which she realized it was. She nodded. "All right," she said. "Get some supper." The night before the hearing, Goss made his final move. It came at dusk, and it came in the form of the man himself, which Clara had not expected. She'd expected another lawyer, another letter, another instrument. She had not expected Franklin Goss to ride up to her gate in person. He was 61 years old, thick through the shoulders, with a silver mustache, and the kind of permanent tan that came from spending decades outdoors doing work that other men did for you. He had the bearing of a man who had been powerful for so long that it had become structural, something built into the way he sat a horse. Clara was on the porch when she saw him coming. She didn't go inside. She stood up. Jackson came out of the barn. Goss pulled up at the gate and looked at the property with the slow proprietary gaze of a man taking inventory of something he considered already his. Then he looked at Clara. Then briefly and assessingly at Jackson. Then back at Clara. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was the voice of a man who had never had to raise it to get what he wanted. "Mr. Goss," she said. "I thought it might be useful for us to speak directly," he said, "without lawyers, before tomorrow." "I'm listening," she said. He came through the gate and stopped at a distance that was respectful enough to be polite and close enough to be deliberate. "I've been pursuing this land for a long time," he said. "You know that. Your father knew it. I want you to understand that this has never been personal." "Diverting my creek felt personal," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not guilt. Goss didn't do guilt, but a minor recalibration. That was a business decision about water allocation. "Made the day after I declined your offer," she said. "Timing is what it is," he said. "The offer I'm making tonight is final, and it's better than anything I've put to you before." He named a figure. It was a good figure. It was a genuinely good figure, and she hated that she had to acknowledge it even internally, because it was the kind of number that would let her start over somewhere else cleanly without debt. "No," she said. Goss looked at her steadily. "The hearing tomorrow is not going to go the way your lawyer has told you it will." "My lawyer is thorough," she said. "My lawyer is experienced," he said, and the weight in the word experienced was not subtle. "And the judge, she said, is aware that the federal land office in Cheyenne has taken an interest in this matter." She watched his face. There it was, the small, precise tightening around his eyes. He hadn't known about the federal involvement. Carver had missed it, or hadn't passed it on in time. "Any ruling tomorrow will be subject to federal review. I'd imagine that changes some of the calculations your lawyer has been making." Goss was quiet for a moment. How was good. She'd give him that. He absorbed it without visible disruption and kept his face calm and his voice even. "Federal reviews can take years," he said. "Yes," she said. "They can. During which time this property remains mine, the cattle operation continues, and the foster contract we hold produces revenue that covers our operating costs and the banknote with room to spare." She folded her hands in front of her. "So you can see why I'm not in any particular hurry." The silence stretched out. Goss looked at her in a way she'd never quite had him look at her before, not the calculating patience of a man waiting for a weakness, but something closer to actual assessment. Like he was seeing her for the first time as an opponent rather than an obstacle. "Your father was a stubborn man," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "He was." He looked past her at Jackson. "And you've got help from an interesting quarter." "I have a capable ranch hand," she said. "Same as always." Goss looked at Jackson for a long moment. Jackson looked back at him. "Read," Goss said. Jackson nodded once, didn't speak. "I know what you did in Denver," Goss said. "Most people who need to know do," Jackson said. "And you know what that makes your testimony worth in a county courtroom." "I know what it makes it worth in a federal review," Jackson said. Another silence. Goss looked back at Clara. "Last offer," he said. "Still no," she said. He looked at her for one final moment, long and level, and without the smile he usually had, and then he turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. Clara stood on the porch until he was out of sight. Then her hands, which had been perfectly still the entire time, started shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs, breathed. Jackson came and stood at the base of the porch steps. He didn't know about the federal oversight, he said. No, she said. He didn't. That's going to change how his lawyer approaches tomorrow. Yes. You rattled him. Good, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. That was the idea. He looked up at her. Your hands are shaking, he said. She looked down. They were. Still. She curled them into fists and then uncurled them deliberately. I know, she said. I didn't say anything else about it. He didn't offer a reassurance she didn't need or make it into something larger than it was. He just stood there at the base of the steps, present and solid, which was, she was beginning to understand what Jackson Reed did instead of most of the things other people did. Go get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow's yours. She went inside. She didn't sleep for 2 hours, and then she did, and she didn't dream about anything at all. The hearing was held in the county courthouse in Millhaven, in a room that smelled like wood polish and old argument. Clara wore her best dress, which was not elaborate, but was clean and pressed and serious, and she sat beside Caldwell at the claimant's table and put her hands flat on the surface in front of her, and looked at the judge with the expression her father had always called her courthouse face, open, attentive, entirely composed. Goss sat at the respondent's table with a lawyer named Prescott, who was expensive-looking and immediately began arranging papers with the performative efficiency of a man who wanted everyone in the room to understand that he'd seen more courtrooms than they had. The judge was a man named Hargrove. 60-something, direct with reading glasses, he pushed up his nose like a weapon. He did not look like a man who appreciated wasted time. Caldwell had said, Hargrove is fair. Not friendly, not unfriendly. Fair. That's all we need. The hearings opened with Prescott presenting Goss's ownership, standing argument, the Aldridge note acquisition, the constructive transfer claim, the theoretical partial interest in the Whitmore property. He was smooth and thorough, and Clara listened to every word with her courthouse face on and her hands flat on the table. Hargrove listened, asked 2 questions, made a note. Caldwell presented the counter. He was not smooth, he was precise, which was better. He laid out the original land patent, the continuous ownership chain, the legal standard for constructive transfer in territorial property disputes, and the specific provisions under which a debt acquisition did not constitute ownership transfer without a court order or voluntary conveyance. He was clear enough that even Clara, who already knew all of it, felt the logic of it like something physical. Hargrove listened, asked 4 questions, made several notes. Then he said, the constructive transfer argument fails on its face under the territorial statute. The note acquisition gives Mr. Goss a creditor position, not an ownership position. Move to the water rights claim. Prescott's face did something small and controlled. Clara kept her hands flat. Caldwell, without any visible reaction, moved to the water rights claim. This was where it got complicated, and this was where Prescott came back to life. Goss's upstream origination argument, the application filing the established precedent for diversion rights in drought conditions. He was good. Clara watched Hargrove's face and couldn't read it, and had to settle for watching his pen, which moved steadily across his notes. Then Caldwell presented the diversion evidence, Jackson's survey, the mapped location of the diversion dam, the timeline showing the creek drop beginning precisely 2 weeks after Clara refused Goss's first offer, the county road access records showing vehicle traffic on the public Ridge Road, consistent with construction activity on the tributary in the relevant period. And then the piece Clara hadn't known about until that morning when Caldwell had arrived at the ranch early, with a look on his face that she'd never seen on him before. A signed affidavit. From a man named Tom Dare, who had worked Goss's North operation for 4 years and had been laid off 6 weeks ago and had come to Caldwell's office in Cheyenne 3 days before the hearing with information about a diversion project he'd been paid to help build on a section of creek tributary in August of 1887, on land that was not Goss's. Prescott objected. Hargrove overruled. read the affidavit himself slowly, while the room was completely quiet. Clara did not look at Goss. She looked at her hands. She heard the scratch of Hargrove's pen. "Mr. Prescott," Hargrove said, "I'm going to need you to address the affidavit." What followed was 40 minutes of legal argument that Clara followed word by word, and that Caldwell navigated with the controlled precision of a man who had spent 3 days preparing for exactly this. Prescott tried to discredit disgruntled former employee, motivated by the layoff, no corroborating physical evidence. Caldwell pointed to the survey data, the timeline, the specific technical details in Dare's account that matched the surveyed structure in ways a non-participant couldn't have fabricated. Hargrove asked to see the survey diagrams. He looked at them for a long time. "This diversion structure," he said. "Is it still in place?" "Yes, Your Honor," Caldwell said. "I'm ordering a site inspection by the county surveyor," Hargrove said. "Pending that inspection, the water rights application is suspended." Prescott was on his feet. "Your Honor." "Sit down, Mr. Prescott." Hargrove was already making notes. "The application is suspended, not denied. If the site inspection contradicts the evidence presented today, the applicant may refile. But given the affidavit and the corroborating survey data, I am not prepared to rule on an application where there is material evidence of artificial interference with the natural flow in question." He looked up over his reading glasses. "Is that clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," Caldwell said. "Yes, Your Honor," Prescott said in the tone of a man renegotiating his internal position. Hargrove looked at both tables. "We'll reconvene pending the surveyor's report. This hearing is in recess." He stood. Everyone stood. Clara exhaled. It was not a victory. Not yet. But the constructive transfer claim was dead. The water rights application was suspended, and a county surveyor was going to go look at a diversion dam on public land that should not exist. Caldwell leaned close. "That's better than I expected from a first hearing," he said quietly. "Is it enough?" she said. "The surveyor's report will be enough," he said. "If the structure is there, and it is, Hargrove is going to have to rule against the application and may open an interference inquiry against Goss." He paused. "Clara, this is very good." She nodded. She stood up. Goss was already leaving Prescott at his elbow, both of them with the forward-moving posture of men in the middle of a rapid strategy adjustment. She watched them go. Then she turned and walked out of the courthouse. Jackson was outside. He hadn't been permitted in the hearing. He wasn't a witness in today's session, and Caldwell had decided it was better to have him outside, where Goss's people couldn't observe his reactions. He was leaning against the post at the bottom of the courthouse steps, hat in hand, and he looked up when she came out. He read her face. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The affidavit," he said. "You didn't know about it until this morning." "Caldwell's been working his own channels," she said. "He didn't want to tell me until he was sure it would hold." "Smart man." "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "How do you feel?" It was such a direct question, asked in such a direct way, that she almost didn't know what to do with it. Men in her experience asked how things had gone, or what happened next. They did not tend to ask how she felt. "Careful," she said. "Like I'm walking on ice that's probably solid, but I haven't put my full weight down yet." He nodded, like that was the right answer. "It's going to hold," he said. "You don't know that." "I know what a county surveyor is going to find when he goes out to that creek," he said. "I built the map. The structure is there, it's clearly artificial, and it's clearly on public land." He put his hat back on. "It's going to hold." She looked at him for a moment. "Pete's going to want to celebrate," she said. "Pete's going to want to open that bottle of rye he's been keeping under his bunk since Easter," Jackson said. She almost laughed. "How do you know about that?" "He told me, in confidence," which apparently means he told me. He started walking toward the wagon. "Come on, let's go home." There was that word again. Home. She fell into step beside him and didn't remark on it. But it settled in her chest, the way it had the first time, warm and complicated and entirely unwilling to be filed away. Pete did open the rye. They sat on the porch that evening, all of them, which was unusual enough to feel like an occasion, though no one called it that. Pete and Emilio and Davis on the steps, Jackson in the chair at the end, Clara in her usual place on the bench. The bottle made a round. Davis coughed when he sipped and tried to pretend he hadn't. Nobody talked about the hearing directly. They talked about the south fence and the fall cattle drive and whether the young mare was ready for a longer ride. They talked about a story Pete had about a judge in Kansas in 1869, which was almost certainly partly invented, but was told with the conviction of a man who believed his own improvements on history. It was the most ordinary evening they'd had all summer. Clara sat with her glass and listened to Pete's story, and felt something in her chest that she recognized distantly as peace. The specific, unfamiliar peace of a person who has been braced against disaster for so long that they've forgotten the feeling of not being braced. She looked at Jackson. He was looking at her. He looked away first, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. She noticed it, and then she noticed that she'd noticed it, and then she looked at the dark land beyond the porch and finished her drink and told herself she was tired. She was tired. She was also something else, and she was running out of the particular energy it took to keep not naming it. 2 days later, the county surveyor filed his report. Caldwell sent word within the hour of receiving it. The structure was confirmed artificial, recently constructed on public land, with materials consistent with those used on Goss's North operation. The surveyor had noted in the dry language of official reports that the placement and design of the diversion were such that they would produce, quote, a significant and measurable reduction in downstream flow to properties holding prior access rights. Hargrove issued a supplementary ruling the same afternoon. The water rights application was denied. The diversion structure was ordered removed within 2 weeks at Goss's expense. An inquiry into potential interference with established water access rights was formally opened, which was not a criminal proceeding, but was the kind of official attention that made men like Goss very uncomfortable and their lawyers very busy. The Whitmore Ranch's water access rights were confirmed as prior continuous and legally protected. Caldwell came out in person to deliver it, which Clara took as a sign that he wanted to see her face when she heard it. She read the ruling. She set it down. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "It's done. The inquiry is ongoing," Caldwell said. "But the ranch is yours, the water is yours, and Goss has a great deal to answer for, to several different authorities. I don't think you'll hear from him directly again." He paused. "I think he's going to be occupied for some time." She nodded. "Thank you, Arthur," she said, and she meant it with the specific depth of a person thanking someone who helped them keep the thing they would have been broken without. Caldwell shook her hand. "Your father would be proud," he said. "For what it's worth, from a man who met George Whitmore twice and found him formidable, I think you're more so." After he left, she walked out to the east pasture, not for any purpose, just to walk on her land in the late afternoon August sun and feel the ground under her feet and know it was hers. She walked for a while. Then she stood still. She heard footsteps behind her. Even unhurried the walk, she could identify by now, the way she could identify the creak of her own porch. Jackson stopped a few feet behind her. She didn't turn around. "We won," she said. "Yes," he said. "The water's ours. The inquiry's open. Goss is going to be dealing with this for a long time." "Yes." She turned around. Howe was standing in the long grass with his hat in his hands and the late light on his face, and the expression he had when he was not managing anything, when he'd dropped the careful distance and was just present, just himself, without the professional buffer he usually kept between his feelings and the world. She had seen that expression before. She was starting to understand what it meant. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. He was quiet. "I've been thinking about that," he said, and another pause, the kind that meant he'd made a decision and was deciding whether to say it. "I got a letter," he said. "Yesterday." He reached into his shirt pocket. "Offer from a man in Texas. Big operation, good wages. He's been looking for someone with my background in contracts and logistics." He held out the letter. "It's a good offer." She took it. She looked at it. Her face didn't change. She'd had years of practice at her face not changing. "It is a good offer," she said. "Yes." She handed it back. "Is that what you want?" she said. "Texas." He looked at her. "I don't know what I want," he said, which from Jackson Reed was the most honest possible answer, because he didn't say things he didn't mean, and he didn't claim certainty he didn't have. She held his gaze. "I should probably leave," he said slowly. "Before—" He stopped. She waited. "Before I do something foolish," he said. The August air sat between them. Clara Whitmore, who had rebuilt her father's accounts and reset fence posts in the dark, and faced Franklin Goss on her own porch, and stared down a lawyer in a county courthouse, and filed a federal escalation before anyone told her she could. Looked at this man, this wandering, honest, fixed things without being asked man, and felt something that had been refusing to be filed finally open completely. She tilted her head. The smallest, most dangerous smile she had ever worn moved across her face. "Do it first," she said quietly. "Then decide." Jackson Reed stood very still. His hat was in his hands. The road was behind him, and he couldn't move a single inch. He stood there for a long time, hat in his hands, road behind him. Her words sitting in the air between them, like something that had changed the temperature of the whole August evening. Do it first, then decide. Jackson Reed had ridden into 100 towns and ridden out of every single one of them, and he had always known when it was time to go, because leaving had never cost him anything he couldn't afford to lose. He'd told himself that was freedom. He'd told himself that a man who didn't stay anywhere, couldn't be taken from anywhere, couldn't be gutted by the particular grief of losing a place that had become part of him. He had believed that completely. Right up until this moment, standing in a east pasture in Wyoming, with his hat in his hands, and Clara Whitmore looking at him like she already knew what he was going to do before he did. "That's not a fair thing to say," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't. You know what it means." "I know what I meant by it," she said. "What it means is up to you." He looked at her. He looked at the land around her. Her land he'd spent 6 weeks repairing and protecting and learning the way you learn a place when you've stopped just passing through it. He looked at the ranch house behind her the barn roof. He'd replaced the fence line, he'd reset the east paddock, where the young mare was no longer a problem horse. He looked at all the things he had fixed, and he understood standing there that he had not been fixing a ranch. "Clara," he said. "Jackson," she said in exactly the same tone, which meant she was not going to make this easy for him, which was, he realized, one of the things he loved about her. That she didn't make things easy. That she didn't smooth edges or soften landings. That she told the truth and expected it back, and stood her ground on both. "I have an uncle in Kansas," he said. "I know," she said. "He's 80 years old and he can't work and he needs support. Regular support. I've been sending him wages for 10 years and I can't—" "I know that too," she said. He stopped. "Pete told me," she said. "Months ago. I've known since the 3rd week." He absorbed that. "And," he said. "And nothing," she said. "A man who supports an elderly uncle on a hired hand's wages isn't a man who needs explaining. He's a man who keeps his commitments." She folded her arms. "That's not an obstacle, Jackson. That's a reason." He looked at her. "A reason for what?" he said. She held his gaze steady. "For believing you're the kind of man who stays when he says he will." The evening was very quiet. A horse moved in the paddock. Somewhere across the yard, Pete was talking to Emilio in the low murmur of men ending a workday. The ordinary sounds of a working ranch at dusk. Sounds that Jackson had been hearing for 6 weeks, and that had stopped sounding temporary somewhere along the way without him noticing the exact moment it happened. "I don't have anything," he said. "Not land. Not a name that means something in this territory. Not I rode in here with a worn saddle and $14 and a history that almost got used against you in a federal proceeding." "I know your history," she said. "Clara, you turned them in," she said. "You lost everything, and you walked into a federal office and told them the truth because it was the right thing to do. And then you spent 3 years keeping yourself small and safe and moving so that decision didn't cost you more than it already had." She paused. "I don't want a man with a name or a title or a clean record. I want a man who does the right thing even when it costs him." She looked at him directly. "I already have that man. He's standing in my pasture looking like he's afraid of something." "I am afraid of something," he said. "What?" He was quiet for a moment. "Staying," he said. "Wanting this. Getting it." He met her eyes. "Losing it." She was still for a moment. Then she uncrossed her arms and walked toward him. Not fast, not dramatic. Just the measured, deliberate walk of a woman who had made a decision and was acting on it, and she stopped close enough that he could see every detail of her face in the late light. "You fixed my fence," she said. "You rebuilt my barn roof. You wrote to a cattle buyer in Cheyenne and saved my operating budget and mapped a diversion dam and stood in a courtroom and told the truth about your past in front of a judge, so my case would hold." She paused. "You have been trying not to stay for 6 weeks. You haven't managed it yet." He looked at her. "I haven't," he said. "No," she said. "You haven't." Something broke open in him quietly. Not dramatically. The way things broke open in Jackson Reed from the inside out and without announcement. "I need to write to my uncle," he said. "Tell him I've found a place." Clara's expression didn't change dramatically. But something in it settled something that had been held carefully in place for months, and she looked at him the way she looked at things she'd decided to trust, which was completely and without reservation. "Write to him," she said. "And when you're done, come have supper." She turned and walked back toward the house. He stood in the pasture for another moment, with his hat in his hands and the last of the August sun on his face, and the specific, unfamiliar feeling of a man who had just stopped running and was learning what the ground felt like when you stood still. It felt, he thought, like something that had been waiting for him. He put his hat on and followed her home. The letter to Harlan Reed in Pratt County, Kansas, took Jackson 3 attempts to write. The first attempt was too short, purely logistical information without context. The kind of letter a man writes when he hasn't yet admitted to himself what he's actually saying. The second attempt went too far in the other direction, explanatory to the point of justification, as though he owed his 80-year-old uncle a defense of a decision Harlan would have approved of instantly and without qualification. The third attempt was a single page. It said he had found a place he wanted to stay. It said the ranch was good land with a good future. It said the woman who owned it was the most capable and honest person he had met in 32 years of meeting people. It said he would continue sending money every month and would come to visit in the spring when the roads were passable. It said, "I think you'd like her, Harlan. I think she'd like you too." He sent it with the next postwriter. Clara didn't ask what he'd written. He told her anyway that evening on the porch, not the exact words, but the shape of it, which was all she needed. She listened with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee and her eyes on the dark land. And when he finished, she nodded once, slow and final, like something had been confirmed. "Spring's a good time to travel," she said. "It is," he agreed. "Pratt County is 3 days by stage. 2.5 if the weather's cooperative. We could manage 3 days," she said. "We." Simple as breathing, like it had always been true. He looked at her. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything else about it, because neither of them needed to. The weeks after the ruling had their own particular rhythm, different from the urgent battle-tempo weeks that had preceded them. The crisis was over. The inquiry into Goss's water interference was ongoing, and would be for some time, but it was the kind of ongoing that required a lawyer's attention rather than Clara's, and Caldwell had made it clear he had it well in hand. The diversion structure was removed. The county surveyor oversaw it personally, and within 10 days the creek was running at its normal level, and the north pasture was green again, in the way that green things are when they've been thirsty a long time, and suddenly aren't. Jackson moved the cattle back from the south pasture without being asked. Clara found the empty south pasture on a Tuesday morning and stood at the gate for a moment, and felt something she recognized as joy, quiet and solid. Not the bright flashing kind, but the deep-root kind, the kind that stays. She went to find Jackson, and he was already halfway through rotating the north fence line to account for the recovered grazing area. She watched him work for a moment. "I was going to tell you to do that today," she said. I know, he said. So you did it yesterday. The grass doesn't wait, he said. She shook her head, went back to her work. She was smiling before she reached the house. The town of Millhaven recalibrated. Towns did that. They read outcomes and revised their positions with the unsentimental practicality of people who lived close enough to consequence to understand that backing the wrong side had social costs. The ruling had been public record. The inquiry into Goss was public record. The federal land office's involvement was public record. And Franklin Goss, who had been the most powerful private landowner in the county for 20 years, was now the man whose lawyer was scrambling through 2 separate proceedings, while a surveyor's report sat in official files describing artificial interference with a neighbor's water rights. The sympathy redistribution was not immediate or graceful, but it was real. The first signal was Edna Barlow, who appeared at Clara's gate on a Thursday with an actual pie, not a pretense for a social maneuver, but a genuine apology pie, which Clara recognized by the way Edna held it with both hands and couldn't quite meet her eyes. I want you to know, Edna said, that I didn't understand the full situation when I came before. I know that, Clara said. Franklin Goss has been a fixture in this county for a long time. People assumed he was right because he was powerful, Clara said. That's a common mistake. She paused. Thank you for the pie, Edna. She took it, stepped back to indicate the conversation was over. Edna nodded and left, and Clara went inside and set the pie on the table, and looked at it for a moment, and then called Pete in to eat some, because Pete had a weakness for pie that she considered one of his better qualities. The second signal was more significant. 3 ranchers from the South County men, who had never been outright hostile, but had maintained a careful distance during the worst of it, came to call the following week. Not together, but within the same few days, each with some version of the same conversation. Inquiries about the foster contract questions, about whether the Whitmore operation was taking on additional cattle for the fall drive interest, in how the federal oversight mechanism had worked, and whether it was available to other small operators in the county. Clara answered every question directly and thoroughly. Jackson sat in on 2 of those conversations, and she noticed that the ranchers spoke to him with the kind of straightforward respect that men in this territory reserved for other men whose competence they'd had demonstrated to them by events. She noticed something else too. Jackson answered their questions about the water rights process and the federal escalation with the easy fluency of a man who knew the subject inside out, which he did, having helped build every element of the case, but he answered in a way that consistently redirected credit toward Clara and Caldwell. Not ostentatiously, just accurately. Miss Whitmore had the documents organized. Her attorney identified the federal angle. She'd been planning for this longer than any of us knew. The ranchers left each time with a different understanding of what the Whitmore ranch was and who was running it. That evening, after the last of them had gone, Clara said, "You didn't have to do that." "Do what?" he said, which she was beginning to understand was his standard first response when he'd done something deliberate and didn't want to discuss it. "Redirect every question back to me," she said. "You built half that case." "You built it before I got here," he said. "I helped with the construction. You drew the plans." She looked at him for a long moment. "Jackson," she said. "Clara," he said. "Stop being modest." "I'm being accurate," he said. "There's a difference." She opened her mouth to argue and then closed it because he was right, and she knew it, and the distinction between modest and accurate was exactly the kind of thing he would be precise about. "Fine," she said. "Fine," he agreed, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way it moved when he was not quite smiling but would be if she pushed it slightly further. She did not push it. She let it sit there between them, warm and unspoken. She was getting good at letting things sit between them. The letter from Harlan Reed arrived on a Friday 3 weeks after Jackson had sent his. Jackson was out with the horses when the post came, so it was Pete who brought it in and set it on the kitchen table, with the careful respect of a man who understood that other people's mail was private, but also that this particular letter was probably significant. Clara looked at it. She did not open it. It was addressed to Jackson, but she set it in the center of the table where he would see it immediately. When he came in for the midday meal, he saw it. He picked it up, looked at the handwriting on the front, and went very still in the way he went still when something mattered more than he'd prepared for. He opened it at the table. Clara ate her meal and did not watch him read it, which required a genuine effort of discipline. He finished, set the letter down, picked up his fork. Well, Pete said, because Pete Grady had been running a quiet intelligence operation for 30 years and was not going to stop now. He says he figured it was something like this, Jackson said. Says a man who stays in one place that long either has a problem with the place or a reason. He paused. Says the reason sounds better. Clara looked at her plate. He send anything else? Pete said. Jackson was quiet for a moment. He sent a deed, he said. Clara looked up. Jackson was looking at the folded papers in the envelope. He pulled one out, a document official looking old. He looked at it for a long moment. He's deeding me his 40 acres in Pratt County, he said. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it that she recognized as the sound of a man holding very carefully onto something that was threatening to become too large to hold quietly. Says he's too old to work it, and it ought to go to someone who'll do something with it. He set the document on the table. Says if I'm finally building something, I should have land of my own to bring to it. The kitchen was completely quiet. Pete made a sound that was not quite a word. Emilio, who almost never spoke unless he had something necessary to say, said, "That's a good man, your uncle." "Yes," Jackson said. "He is." Clara looked at the deed on the table. 40 acres in Kansas. Not much. Not a fortune. But land, his own land, deeded to him by the man who'd raised him, given at the exact moment when a man who'd spent years building other people's things was starting to build his own. She thought about what she was going to say. She had the whole afternoon. She found him at the barn after supper. Not hiding, he wasn't a man who hid, but doing the particular thing he did when he needed to think, which was find something to fix and fix it, while his mind worked on the other problem. I was repairing a bridle that had been functional for months, which she noticed and understood. She leaned against the stall post. 40 acres in Kansas, she said. Yes, he said. He kept working. What are you going to do with it? I don't know yet. It's yours, she said. Whatever you do with it. He looked up. I know that. I'm not saying it as a concern, she said. I'm saying it because... She stopped. Started again. I know what it's like to have land that's yours. Really yours. Land someone chose to give you. Not because you bought it, but because they decided you deserved to have it. She paused. It changes something. He set the bridle down. It does, he said. She looked at him steadily. I want to talk to you about something, she said. And I need you to listen all the way through before you say anything. He turned to face her, crossed his arms, waited. She took a breath. I've been thinking about the ranch, she said. About what it is and what it can be. The Foster contract is solid. The water is secure. The inquiry is going to keep Goss occupied for long enough that he won't be a problem. She paused. I need a partner. Not a hired hand. A partner. Someone with a stake in the operation, a share in the decisions, and a reason to be here that isn't a wage. She met his eyes directly. I want to offer you a partnership. Jackson. A formal one. A legal one. A quarter share of the Whitmore operation in exchange for what you've already been doing, which is treating this place like it matters. I was very still. Clara. I said listen, she said. He closed his mouth. I'm not doing this because you saved the ranch, she said. You helped save it, but I'd started the fight before you got here. I'm not doing this out of gratitude. She paused. I'm doing this because you're the best partner I've ever seen. Work because you think 3 steps ahead, and tell me what you find. Because you never once tried to make a decision without bringing it to me first. Because you understand what it means that this land is mine, and you've never tried to make it less than that. She took another breath. And I'm doing this because you have 40 acres in Kansas now, and a name and a future, and I would very much like for that future to be here. And for here to be part of yours. The silence lasted long enough that she heard her own heartbeat. Jackson looked at her. You're not doing this for gratitude, he said slowly. No. And you're not doing it because you need the help. I need the help, she said. But I could find it elsewhere. I'm not offering it elsewhere. Why? He said. Why me, specifically? She held his gaze. Because when I reset that fence post the night after my father died, she said, I was alone, and I told myself I was all right with that I'd always be all right with that. That alone was what I was and what I was good at. She paused. And then you rode in on a Tuesday and started fixing things before you were asked and noticing things before I said them, and standing at the edge of every room I was in like a man who wanted to be there but didn't know if he was allowed. She paused. I'm telling you you're allowed, Jackson. I'm telling you you've been allowed for longer than you probably know. He stood there. He was not a man who cried. She knew that had catalogued enough of his stillnesses to understand where his feeling went when it was too large for the surface, but there was something happening in his face that was the nearest thing she'd seen to it. He unfolded his arms. He picked up his hat from the stall post. He turned it in his hands once the way he did when he was landing on a decision. A quarter share, he said. To start, she said. He looked at her. To start, he agreed. And then he crossed the barn in 3 steps, and she didn't move back, and he put his hands on either side of her face, careful as a man handling something he intended to keep, and kissed her in the way that a man kisses a woman when he has been deciding not to for 6 weeks and has finally completely and without reservation stopped deciding. She kissed him back the way she did everything completely and without giving ground. When they broke apart, she was steady on her feet. He was not entirely. She found that satisfying. The paperwork, she said. Tomorrow, he said. Caldwell will need to draw it up. Tomorrow, he said again, closer this time. Jackson. Clara. She looked at him. How was smiling fully, completely, the first full smile she had seen from him. And it was the kind of smile that changed a person's entire face, that made you understand what someone looked like when they stopped carrying something they'd been carrying too long. Tomorrow, she said. Supper first. She walked out of the barn. He followed. The paperwork was drawn up on a Monday. Caldwell came out from Cheyenne himself, which Clara suspected was because he wanted to be present for the occasion, more than because the task required his personal attention. He drew up the partnership agreement with the same precision he'd brought to the water rights case, and he read through it with both of them sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd built the legal case for the ranch's survival, the same table where Jackson had written down everything Carver had asked around town, the same table where Clara had pressed her hands flat and run the numbers until they added up. Quarter share as discussed. Equal standing on operational decisions above a defined threshold. Revenue split, calculated quarterly. Terms for expansion if and when. A clause added at Jackson's request that specified his existing financial commitment to Harlan Reed in Pratt County as a prior obligation that the partnership would accommodate rather than compete with. Clara had read that clause and said nothing. She had added one of her own, which Caldwell had written in without comment. A provision that the partnership agreement would include a right of first offer should either party choose to expand land holdings in the county. 40 acres in Kansas. A quarter share of the Whitmore Ranch. 2 people who had been building something without admitting it, building it on paper now. They both signed. Caldwell signed as witness. Pete signed as second witness, and then had to take a moment outside, which Clara pretended not to notice. That evening, Jackson wrote a second letter to his uncle. He didn't tell Clara what was in it. She didn't ask. But she saw him smiling when he sealed the envelope, and she understood that the letter was not complicated, that it was probably short the way important things were when you'd finally gotten clear enough to say them simply. She thought about what she would have written in the same position. She thought, I found the place. Took me longer to say it out loud than to know it. You'd laugh at that. You'd probably be right to. She didn't write that. She went and made coffee and called him in when it was ready, and they sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of an evening that felt different from every evening before. It not dramatically different, not transformed, but settled in the way things settle when they've finally found the level they were always trying to reach. I want to expand the east herd next year, she said. I've been looking at the north pasture numbers, he said. With the water restored, we've got capacity. The Foster contract has a volume option, she said. If we can hit the threshold by spring. We can hit it, he said. You sound very certain. I know what the land can do, he said. And I know who's managing it. She looked at him over her coffee cup. He looked back. It was the most ordinary moment. Two people at a kitchen table at the end of a working day, talking about cattle numbers and spring contracts and what the North pasture could carry. It was the best moment she could remember in a very long time. 3 weeks later, Harlan Reed's 40 acres in Pratt County, Kansas, were placed in a trust administered jointly by Jackson Reed and the Whitmore Ranch Partnership. Not merged, not sold, held. A piece of land that belonged to both of them, now separate from the ranch, but connected to it, the way that things in a life are connected not by geography, but by the people who care for them. Harlan himself wrote to Clara directly, one letter in handwriting that shook a little, but was deliberate with its words. He tells me you're the kind of woman who doesn't need telling twice, it said. He means that as high praise. So do I. Take care of my boy. He's better at taking care of everything else than he is at himself. I expect you already know that. H.R. Clara read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it in the accounts book between 2 pages in the place where the handwriting changed from 2 styles to 1. She kept it there. The fall came on, like it always did in Wyoming, fast and cold and entirely sincere, the way the seasons came when they meant it. The North pasture was green and full. The cattle were fat going into autumn, which the cattle buyer Foster noted with satisfaction when he came to finalize the fall delivery. He shook Jackson's hand, first, then Clara's, and then looked between them with the assessing eye of a man who'd done enough business to read a partnership in how 2 people stood near each other. Good operation, he said. I'd like to extend the contract. 3 years. Clara looked at Jackson. Jackson looked at Clara. We'll need to review the terms, she said. Of course, Foster said. Send them to Caldwell, Jackson said. He handles our legal review. Our. Same as we. Same as the way they stood near each other, which Foster had noticed, and which Clara no longer tried to make smaller than it was. She had spent 6 weeks making things smaller than they were. She was done with that. After Foster left, Pete came to the porch with his hat in his hands, which was his serious thing posture, and Clara braced for whatever new complication had arrived. Got something to say, Pete said. Say it, she said. He looked between them. 30 years I worked this land for George Whitmore, he said. Good years. Hard ones. Some years I didn't know if we'd make it through. He paused. I know what this ranch looked like in July. He paused again. I know what it looks like now. He put his hat back on. That's all. He walked away. Clara looked at Jackson. Jackson was looking at the land. She followed his gaze out past the porch, past the barn roof he'd replaced, past the east paddock where the young mare ran with her head up and her stride long and easy, past the north fence line running true and tight, all the way to the horizon where Wyoming went blue and enormous in the autumn air. What are you thinking? She said. He was quiet for a moment. That I almost left, he said. But you didn't, she said. No, he said. I didn't. She stood beside him and looked at the same land. Jackson, she said. Yeah. Next time you think you should leave before you do something foolish. I know, he said. Do it first, she said. Then decide. He looked at her. She was not quite smiling, but her eyes were. He took her hand. Not dramatically. Not with ceremony. Just took it the way you take hold of something you intend to keep, and stood beside her, looking out at the land that belonged to both of them now. Not on paper, not yet, but in the way that mattered more than paper, in the way that a place becomes yours. Not when you're given it, but when you choose it every day, with everything you are. Some men spend their whole lives riding toward a place they can't name. Jackson Reed had ridden into Millhaven, Wyoming on a Tuesday in August, with a worn saddle and $14 and a history he'd been carrying alone for 3 years. He had come to fix a fence. He had stayed because some things, once you see them clearly, you cannot unfind. And Clara Whitmore, who had reset a fence post in the dark, and filed documents before the battle started, and faced Franklin Goss on her own porch, without flinching, had learned something that summer that she would carry the rest of her life. The strongest thing she had ever done was not the legal filing, not the courthouse face, not the steady hands during the hearing. The strongest thing she had ever done was open the door. Not the door of the house, not any door you could point to. The door she had kept shut for 3 years, because keeping it shut had felt like strength, and she had not yet understood that letting someone in the right, someone on a Tuesday, with honest hands and a worn saddle, was not weakness. It was the bravest kind of choosing there is. A real home is not the place where you were born. It is not the land your father broke his back to claim, though that matters too, and always will. A real home is the place where someone looks at everything. You are the courthouse face, and the shaking hands, and the handwriting that changed, and the fence posts reset in the dark, and chooses without reservation to stand beside it. They stood there together in the autumn air. The ranch was behind them, and the land was before them, and the story that had begun on a Tuesday in August with a man on a gray horse, and a letter that said 30 days had become something that neither of them would have predicted, and both of them would have chosen again from the very beginning. That is all a story needs to be. That is in the end everything.